The torchlight caught the silk and the fear at once. A woman in a senator's house sat rigid at the table, while music thudded like a heartbeat and servants moved like shadows. She had been told this was a banquet of honour. She had been told the emperor would pass and praise the household. Instead, the emperor came to measure her as an object, to spread jokes and choices across the room like a butcher displaying cuts. Around her, men laughed because they had to. Some wore polite smiles that did not reach their eyes. Others did not move at all, hands white on goblets. The emperor walked the line of tables and stopped, lingering where finger bones met lace. He ordered a woman to stand. He spoke, and the room obeyed. No one spoke her name. She became a possession momentarily announced and publicly assessed. The moment was surgical, humiliation performed as spectacle. The woman felt every eye, every inch of silence that had been weaponized. She learned the simplest rule of the empire that night. Power could take what it wanted and leave no law behind it. If you enjoy these dark histories, leave a like and subscribe. Comment below where you're listening from. I'm genuinely curious to know where these stories reach. The woman at the table would later be recorded only as one of the senator's wives, a citizen swallowed by imperial narrative. The city that watched this happen was Rome. The man who passed judgment, Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, better known to history as Elagabalus or Heliogabalus, sat beneath garlands and a foreign god symbol and treated the room as a stage. The story of that night appears in the fragments of Cassius Dio and the flamboyant pages of the Historia Augusta. Both writers flatly record scenes designed to shock. We will return to those texts because they are the bloodstains on the page, but the traces that survive are not pure. They come through enemies, through moralists, through senators who had a vested interest in delegitimizing an emperor who ignored them. Still, the core is consistent. An emperor used banquets as a laboratory for humiliation, and the victims, often women of high rank, moved like offerings under his gaze. We start with this one lamplit moment because it contains the essential question Elagabalus posed to Rome. What happens when the man at the top decides human dignity is optional? He was not born to Rome's centre. He was born in Emesa, a Syrian town in the province of Syria, into a family that held the hereditary priesthood of the sun god Elagabal. The priesthood carried a ritual prestige that in the eastern provinces could rival political titles. The young priest's birth name, Varius Avitus Bassianus, tied him to a dynastic web that included his grandmother Julia Maesa and his cousin, who would later be emperor. The family traced influence through marriage into the Severan dynasty after Septimius Severus married his daughter to a Roman general. In Emesa, boys learned rites and ritual, how to carry a sacred stone, how to lead processions, how a god could be made present by a moving body. He learned ceremony first, spectacle later. Those early lessons mattered because they taught him the most dangerous thing an emperor could possess, the belief that ritual could reshape politics. The cult of the Emesian sun was not incidental to his rule, it was the fuse of his reign. The ceremonies he knew in a provincial temple would be carried to the Palatine, and there the lines between god, priest and emperor would blur until Rome could no longer tell where religion ended and tyranny began. Varius's household was unusual. His mother, Julia Soaemias, and his grandmother, Julia Maesa, were women of political instinct. When the Severan line cracked after the death of Caracalla and the short reign of Macrinus, 270–218 AD, these Julias saw an opening. They had blood to claim, they had sons and nephews, and they knew how to move money and loyalty among legions. The Syrian legions, stationed near Antioch, were far from the daily scrutiny of Rome's Senate, and often sympathetic to local dynasties. Julia Maesa would later be explicit in the court histories as the architect who pushed her grandson forward. Her manoeuvring is recorded in Cassius Dio, Roman History Book 80, and repeated with different colour by the Historia Augusta. They placed young Varius at the heart of a claim that combined sacred office and imperial blood. A priest of Elagabal, presented as a legitimate heir to the Severan line. What begins in the provinces as a local claim supported by money and soldier loyalty would soon arrive at the gates of the city and break Rome's fragile rituals of governance. The march on power was not a single thunderclap. It was a composed campaign of persuasion and force. Soldiers who had grown accustomed to being paid well by Eastern elites found Maesa's coin persuasive. The legions proclaimed the boy emperor in 218 AD under the name Marcus Aurelius Antoninus. the name the Severans had weaponized to claim continuity. They moved south, and forces loyal to Macrinus were met and routed. Macrinus himself would be killed, and Rome opened a vacancy at the top of the imperial ladder. The young priest arrived in Rome as a product of a quick provincial revolution, an outsider whose claim had been bought with gold and clamoured into being with steel. He was no military genius. He was a symbol lifted by the ambitions of women and soldiers. Still, symbols can become real in the hands of empire. Rome's elites in the city were stunned. A 14 to 18-year-old, sources differ on his exact age at accession, took the purple. The Senate could scream, vote, strip honours. In the end, the legions and imperial household mattered most. That reality allowed Elagabalus to try things no Roman emperor had attempted in living memory, to remake religion, to remould ceremony, and as observers would later note with fury, to remake the boundaries of private life inside the palace. Arrival in Rome enlarged his instruments. He took a retinue of Syrian priests, the sacred black stone of Elagabalus, an object the court historians described as a meteorite, and he set about integrating this provincial cult into Rome's sacral geography. The Palatine Hill would become a place where Eastern ritual and Roman intimacy collided. He built a temple, the Elagabalium, and for a time he carried the symbol of Elagabal into the processions of Roman gods. Ancient writers saw this as sacrilege. Cassius Dio framed it as an outraged Romanism. The Historia Augusta made it scandalous theatre. Yet this was not merely theological stubbornness. The act was political. To elevate Elagabal was to displace Jupiter, and to place a Syrian priest-king in a role that mixed divinity with imperial command. The implications were seismic. Within months, Rome felt the difference. Its emperor had a new god, a new court, and a new language of power that did not speak the old senatorial code. Early in his time in Rome, he drew attention by changing what the emperor could be in public. He wore Eastern garments, ornaments alien to Roman civic dress, and allowed his rituals to rearrange court etiquette. He publicly accepted the role of high priest and invested the office with imperial privilege. That behaviour alone offended Rome's conservative memory. But the rupture grew worse in private. The Palatine's inner rooms, the banqueting halls, the triclinium, the secluded chambers used for imperial reception, became laboratories where the emperor tested new social arrangements. The official record emphasises excess. Banquets that stretched 2 days, meals of exquisite and repulsive luxury, and entertainments designed to shock. Historians disagree over motive. Some see a wild young man indulged by sybaritic tastes. Others see an intentional assault on the Roman aristocracy, a strategy to unmake the elite's moral authority. Either way, a pattern emerges. The emperor took scenes of domestic life and converted them into public measurement tools, where status, gender and dignity were rearranged as if they were props. The banquets were reported as theatre with rules. Guests sat. Servants moved. Music softened the edges of what happened. Ancient chroniclers describe moments in which Elagabalus would have his attendants parade women, noble women, wives of senators, before a gathering that included their own husbands. Those husbands were expected to be amused, to applaud, to accept. The sources are specific in the accusation. Guests were reduced to an audience. Women became objects of imperial commentary. Cassius Dio's description reads like a legal complaint against an emperor who weaponized spectacle. The Historia Augusta, with its moral outrage, amplifies the details: mock weddings, insults, and forced performances. We cannot take every intimate detail as literal fact. The sources were writing to discredit a ruler whose values they found abhorrent, but patterns repeat across accounts. When stories replicate in hostile writers, they point to a truth more than a grapevine rumour. The emperor's banquets functioned as instruments of power and public humiliation. For the men who sat at those tables, the banquet was a test. Senators and commanders had to negotiate public obedience and private ruin. To defy the emperor publicly risked immediate punishment. To comply demanded acceptance of an insult that would follow them home. That was the point. Elagabalus was not only indulging appetite, he was reshaping the code of honour that bound Rome's governing class. Honour was the fabric of Roman politics. Strip it from a man publicly, and you do something heavier than humiliation. You crush the legitimacy of his voice in the forum. It is important to record that senators did sometimes whisper and conspire. Cassius Dio notes that the elite hated these changes and plotted, but they were also compromised by years of patronage and by the presence of Syrian soldiery that defended the emperor. The Praetorian Guard's loyalty was not absolute. It could be bought or beaten into alignment. Still, for a while, the trinket of imperial favour kept many mouths closed. Women who found themselves paraded had no public recourse. Roman wives of the elite were citizens, but their legal controls were different. Chastity and honour were social currencies. Families could barter reputation, but not replace a daughter's public humiliation. The act of being displayed at the emperor's table was a civic injury as much as a private one because Roman civic identity hinged on the household. When an emperor transformed domestic privacy into spectacle, he undermined the foundations of social order. Ancient sources record that some families suffered ruined alliances, broken marriages, and lifelong disgrace after imperial exhibitions. Again, bias warns us, chroniclers wanted to show a ruler unfit, yet the repetition of story across several records suggests systemic behaviour. Elagabalus's banquets were more than drunken nights. They were ritualised instruments of domination that used women as the medium. The stories that made Rome shudder were often presented as moral parable. The emperor's marriages, for instance, were told in terms meant to scandalise. Among the most explosive acts reported was his marriage to a Vestal virgin, Aquilia Severa. A Vestal's vow of chastity was a public sacred pledge. Ancient sources, particularly the Historia Augusta, insist Elagabalus took her as a bride, and that he declared the union a sign that he would father gods, not men. The act was described as both religious blasphemy and political theatre, an attempt to fuse a foreign cult's priesthood with Rome's most ancient sacrament. To modern historians, this story is complicated. Vestals were central to Roman religion, and any offence toward the Vestal order would inflame the city. The claim that he married Aquilia Severa appears in those hostile narratives as proof of radical disrespect. It is also a clear example of how Elagabalus's behaviour violated institutional lines in ways that made senators and pious Romans outraged. Beyond marriages, ancient authors detailed explicitly sexual transgressions and personal role reversals. Cassius Dio notes that the emperor allowed and advertised relationships that confounded Roman sexual expectations. He is said to have offered payment for sex with men and women alike, to have set up situations that men of rank would find degrading, and to have indulged in public cross-dressing. The Historia Augusta adds colour. The emperor prostituted himself in public and asked for the title of lady instead of lord. Modern historians treat those claims cautiously. Both Dio and the Historia Augusta are openly hostile, and their goal was to paint the emperor as morally degenerate. Yet they likely do not invent the pattern. Elagabalus openly rejected Roman norms of gender and piety in ways that threatened foundational institutions. Whether every lurid detail is factually precise is arguable. Whether the cumulative image is accurate is less so. It is clear that his reign manifested an overt challenge to Roman social codes. Behind the scandalous anecdotes lay a political machine run by women who had revived their families' fortunes. Julia Maesa and Julia Suemius were always present figures in accounts of the emperor's reign. Maesa, in particular, had shrewdly placed her grandson on the throne. Once he was in power, she attempted to manage the chaos. Ancient sources indicate she tolerated much because the throne belonged to the family line and because she feared reprisals if the emperor were replaced. Her role is a vital reminder. The palace was not a theatre of chaos without management. The emperor sometimes hurt himself politically, and when he did, the Julias tried to repair the damage. That tension between the emperor's impulses and his family's political calculations informs many episodes. She moved between protection, enabling, correction, and finally, concession in the face of lethal opposition. Still, Maesa's control had limits. The emperor's behaviour provoked opponents who were not only moralists but also political actors. Senators were losing ground. The army's loyalties remained fickle. Elagabalus's elevation of Eastern cult and his rumoured favouritism towards certain freedmen and companions alienated traditional power brokers. He promoted people from outside the senatorial class, he lavished honours on Syrian associates, and he seemed to mock Roman ceremonial. This combination of religious innovation and social provocation is what made the banquets so threatening. They were the public face of a broader attempt to reorder Roman hierarchy. When private life becomes public spectacle, political order is at stake. That is the fear dissipating through the sources. Rome's conservative institutions could tolerate eccentricity in private, but they resisted a sustained public program that subverted their authority. The banquets themselves followed rituals Elagabalus invented. A guest would enter a lit atrium into a scene that contained both Roman eating customs and unfamiliar Eastern ornament, exotics, incense, saffron, sometimes descriptions of odd foods and animals. The emperor staged his tables to emphasize spectacle and vulnerability. Women were turned into ornaments and sometimes into instruments of sexual display. Ancient accounts tell of mock marriages and forced embraces. The emperor's actions were theatrically cruel. They insisted on public proof of submission. This behavior had a second, more dangerous effect. It created guilt and complicity. Senators who participated, even from a place of coercion, were recorded by later chroniclers as morally stained. The theatre had a double audience, public spectators and private witnesses whose reputations the emperor could weaponize. The instruments of control were not just spectacle and fear, they were exchange and incentive. The emperor rewarded those who complied with offices, money, and public praise. He punished those who refused by public humiliation or exile. The palace's internal economy became a tool for securing loyalty, soldiers, freedmen, and clients, who served well-received favour. Those who resisted were marginalised. The banquets fit this pattern. They were a social experiment where reward and punishment were visible and immediate. The effect was a court where silence had monetary value and dissent carried immediate cost. When collective power rests on personal favour, the system becomes brittle. A single, violent whim can topple reputations and break networks that took generations to build. It is vital to note the human consequences beyond political calculations. Women who were paraded and displayed suffered lifelong damage. Records, often fragmentary, tell of ruined marriages, families that hid daughters, and households that closed off wings where shame was kept. Roman society's punitive moral economy meant that victims, not perpetrators, often paid the higher cost. A senator whose wife was humiliated lost social capital. Families arranged marriages to preserve honour, and sometimes found those honours eroded by imperial ridicule. In some cases, ancient sources record suicides and madness among the city's noblewomen. Again, the evidence is uneven. Chroniclers had political axes to grind, but the consistency of the pattern in hostile sources suggests we cannot dismiss the personal tragedies. We must treat them as political injury made corporeal. The empire's violence landed in bodies in its own capital. The emperor's appetite for offence extended beyond sexual theatre. He reportedly forced men of rank to accept ignominious titles and made public jokes at private expense. The Historia Augusta tells of a senator compelled to act in a foreign costume, another who had to be the emperor's servant for a night, humiliation dressed up as entertainment. These acts did not merely aim to amuse an erotic court, they functioned as a language of dominance. To force a man of honour to grovel before the emperor in some degraded performance confirmed who held the power. Political memory recorded those scenes as violent because they subverted the very grammar of Roman authority. When dignity is available for purchase or denial at a ruler's whim, institutions that depend on mutual respect lose their coherence. The attempt to control Rome through shock failed politically because institutions pushed back. The Praetorian Guard, at various points, acted in ways that protected the emperor and in ways that betrayed him. Loyalty in Rome depended on the balancing of favour and discipline. When the emperor's acts endangered the guard's reputation, or when he elevated friends seen as undeserving, support could evaporate. The histories suggest that by 221 to 222 AD, the palace climate had become unsustainable. The elite's anger, the army's restlessness, and the emperor's unpredictability produced a dangerous cocktail. Julia Maza, who had engineered the accession from Syria, began to plan contingencies. Her voice remained a political constant. She wanted her family's survival. The court's mood shifted from indulgence to fear and then to decisive action. The conspiracy that brought an end to the emperor's life involved the Praetorian Guard and members of his own household, who had grown weary of his rule. Ancient sources indicate the movement to remove him was both personal and institutional. The guard who one day stood laughing in the emperor's banquets would be the same body that later turned its blades on him. Conspiracies in Rome were rarely elegant. They were messy, full of rumour, deliberate calculations, and sudden opportunities. When soldiers, nobles, and imperial kin agreed that the emperor's survival meant their ruin, they did what Roman political tradition allowed. They replaced him. The outcome was brutal, but it was also the predictable end to a regime that had collapsed its own support structures. Sources describe the assassination as sudden and violent. Soldiers stormed into private chambers. The emperor, now a man whose image had become toxic in the city, was caught without the full protection of his Syrian retinue. They killed him quickly, in some reports stabbing him repeatedly, and many note that his body was desecrated, dragged through the street, thrown into the Tiber, the exact details varying by writer. Cassius Dio records a version, the Historia Augusta another. This is the kind of end that converted rumour into myth. In a city primed by scandal, his death did not erase the wounds he had inflicted, it amplified them. The corpses in the palace were the final punctuation to a reign built on rupture. The emperor who had wielded ritual to remake hierarchies ended like a sacrificial figure cast aside. The city, once the site of his experiments, chose to bury certain truths quickly. The succeeding regime, under Severus Alexander, his cousin who succeeded him with the backing of Julia Maesa, attempted to restore order and to clean Rome's image. The new regime distanced itself from the excesses. It restored traditional religious practice and reasserted senatorial dignity. For the survivors of the Banquets, restoration meant, for many families, nothing like justice. The state's priority was stability, not retribution. The Julias retained influence by pivoting to the new emperor and promising a return to conservative ritual. That pragmatic choice saved the family from extinction, but allowed the memory of victims to be folded back into silence. After his death, writers set to work. Cassius Dio, a senator writing history, catalogued the emperor's excesses as signs of moral collapse. The Historia Augusta turned outrage into spectacle, adding details that read like scandalous theatre. Herodian included notes on the religious disruptions. Modern scholars read these texts with caution, understanding that they aim to explain political failure with moral diagnosis. Bias colours every line. But the existence of bias does not imply fabrication. Institutional alarm, recorded as moral horror by hostile chroniclers, indicates something real occurred that disturbed Rome's governing classes. When elites deploy narrative outrage, it tells us what they feared losing: ritual primacy, honour codes, and the ability to govern private behaviour through public norms. To assess the truth beneath rhetoric, historians weigh motive and consistency. Elagabalus's repositioning of religion is well documented beyond rumour. He built the Elagabalium and attempted to elevate a provincial cult into the centre of Roman worship. That act alone explains elite hostility. The more salacious claims, banquets where senators' wives were displayed, the emperor's cross-dressing, the wholesale defiance of Roman gender norms, come primarily from hostile texts. Yet, when hostile witnesses independently narrate patterns that align with political moves, their accounts gain plausibility. The result is a composite image, an emperor who used public ritual and private spectacle to unsettle the social contract of Rome. The victims were often women forced into the role of instruments in a political theatre aimed at the city's elite. The pain of the victims continued after the emperor's death. Families chose to protect honour by silence. Some daughters were married off quietly to distant men. Others were kept within their homes, hidden from public life. Roman law and custom meant that a woman's chastity and reputation had immediate political value. Families often chose strategies that prioritized restoration of social standing over the pursuit of public accountability. This is not an abstract judgment, it was a survival calculus. A senator with a disgraced daughter risked losing his clients, his alliances, and his public voice. The record shows this pattern repeated. Victims disappeared into private exile while the state moved on. The personal losses were lifelong. The material cover-up extended into official memory. The new administration did not initiate widespread criminal prosecutions. It rewired rituals to mend civic order. Severus Alexander's rule emphasized conventional pietas and reasserted senatorial privileges. The Julias had secured their political survival by trading excess for stability. The palace returned to a mode of rule meant to reassure, to remind Rome that the sacred rites and the social grammar would hold. Yet the intimate brutality of the banquets could not be fully erased. They remained as stories, held in the pages of angry historians and in the quiet of households that had been used and betrayed. The literature that survived judged Elagabalus harshly. For historians like Cassius Dio, the emperor's decadence was a symptom of a deeper decay in the Roman elite. For centuries, the image of his rule became shorthand for moral collapse. The Historia Augusta, though written later and with an agenda of its own, contributed grotesque details that stuck in the public imagination. An emperor who dressed as a woman, who married a vestal, who prostituted himself. Images meant to scar the reader. Modern historians must disentangle spectacle from fact, but they also must not excise human suffering. When the historian's duty is to tell how institutions enabled abuse, these texts serve as evidence of systemic failure. Scholarship in the modern era asks uncomfortable questions. How much of the scandal is moralizing embellishment? And how much is proof of a ruler who weaponized intimacy against the powerful? How did Rome's structure, its concentration of religious and political authority, allow a man like Elagabalus to behave with impunity for years? What responsibility do chroniclers have to contextualize their outrage? The process of answering these questions requires attention to primary sources, to archaeological traces like the Elagabalium's foundations, and to the social logic of Roman honour. Synthesis leads to a hard truth. The emperor's acts, however exaggerated, intersected with real institutional vulnerabilities and had genuine human costs. The tale of the Banquets matters because it reframes the usual structure of imperial violence. Historians' frameworks often think of armies, sieges, law codes. This story forces us to see state power operating on domestic life. An emperor could, by ritual and spectacle, make private bodies the scene of imperial policy. That strategy has a peculiar cruelty. It erases the boundary between public decree and private integrity. The Banquets become a case study in how authority can be performed through degradation. For Rome, a polity built on the household as civic cell, the consequences were corrosive. If a household could be publicly humiliated without legal remedy, then law and custom had lost their teeth. The gender politics involved are important. Elagabalus' apparent rejection of Roman sexual norms threatened a system in which masculinity and public authority were tightly linked. Ancient writers weaponized this violation as proof of unfitness. Whether the emperor's personal gender identity would be labelled confidently by modern categories is irrelevant to the core historical claim. His behaviour destabilised the codes that organised elite life. The consequence was not only personal sorrow but political disarray. Men whose honour mattered in the forum found that honour ripped apart at table. That was the point of the Banquets, to expose the fragility of a social contract dependent on private dignity. For the victims, there were no neat outcomes. Some attempted to reclaim life in remote villas, others lived under a pall of silence. The social and psychological damage is recorded in hints: ghosted ceremonies, silent weddings, daughters kept far from the public eye. Some households treated a daughter's survival as a currency to be guarded. For those women who remained in Rome, their daily presence in social circles was a silent reminder of trauma. Society learned to move around those reminders rather than confront them. The arrangement preserved the elite's outward order, but not the souls of the traumatized. The palace's atmosphere lingered in memory. Servants who had served as witnesses carried stories into the next administrations. The new rulers used those stories to justify corrective policy and to underline their contrast with the former emperor. They emphasized restored decorum. In official rhetoric, a return to orthodoxy healed the city. For victims, rhetoric was little consolation. Restoring public ritual did not repair the intimate rending they had experienced. The healing Rome offered was theatrical: new sacrifices, new titles, public displays of piety designed to reassure the city that the moral order had returned. The legal aftermath is sparse. Rome's court records contain few indictments tied directly to the Banquets' abuses. Part of that was practical. Investigating crimes that took place inside the imperial palace meant exposing the state. Part of it was strategic. The new emperor needed to avoid digging deep into a scandal that would implicate too many powerful families and soldiers. Peace in this case meant suppression. For survivors, the state's reticence was betrayal. The choice to prioritise continuity over justice is an old political calculus, and in this instance it prioritised the city's institutional survival at the expense of personal accountability. This calculus continued to shape Roman memory. Over decades, the story of Elagabalus hardened into a moral fable about excess and divine punishment. Literary art used his reign as a cautionary tale, yet every moral fable simplifies. The more complex truth admits that the banquets were both political acts and personal crimes, nested within a system that allowed them. Institutional silence and familial protection produced a double erasure, crimes that were socially visible but officially invisible. The victims' lives were evidence of the state's failure to secure the private realm from public abuse. In assessing responsibility, historians look at structural problems. The Roman imperial system concentrated sacred and temporal power in one person. When that person combined a priestly identity with sovereign authority, the result was combustible. Elagabalus's elevation of a provincial cult into Rome's heart created an alternate set of loyalties that bypassed traditional institutions. The palace rituals replaced the forum's deliberations. If an emperor can reassign respect at a table, he can reorder politics in subtle, permanent ways. The banquets stand as a case of symbol-level violence. Power appropriated the most intimate symbols, marriage, chastity, hospitality, and used them as weapons. The social language of Roman honour was turned into a means of humiliation. That strategic use of social norms is a classic method of domination. Instead of killing opponents outright, terrorise their households and social networks. The psychological and reputational damage can outlast any brief physical regime, poisoning alliances and eroding trust across generations. Modern readers must keep two things in mind. Source selection matters, and human impact cannot be abstracted away by polemic. The ancient sources clearly testify to acts designed to outrage Rome's elite. They were not neutral. Still, when multiple hostile witnesses narrate practices that twist social norms into instruments of political control, historians must acknowledge reality beneath the invective. The banquets and the public humiliations were political techniques. They were abuses of power that targeted vulnerable bodies to send messages to powerful men. The episode also forces a larger ethical question. How does society answer when its institutions fail to protect citizens from those above them? Rome chose compromise, continuity, and social silence. The cost was human. The banquets remain a lesson in how authority can be exercised through degradation, and how systems of patronage can bind victims, perpetrators, and bystanders into a single, dangerous circle. The moral pain of the survivors recedes in dry history books, but was experienced in sleepless nights, in daughters hidden away, in families that learn to survive by burying their trauma. The final view is quieter than any scandal. Elagabalus's name endures in history for the spectacle, the sacrilege, and the scandals recorded by angry pens. But the lasting wound is in those who were used as instruments of state violence. The senators' wives who are displayed at banquets, whether every lurid detail is strictly factual or part of a political caricature, stand for a class of victims across history. They remind us that when power consolidates without checks, the private becomes a field of policy, and bodies become the evidence of a regime's reach. The empire carried on. Severus Alexander's reign tried to repair civic rituals. The Julias retained influence by trading excess for stability. Rome produced new histories, new rituals, and a new equilibrium. But the memory of those banquets did not vanish. It entered literature, it formed a cautionary tale about the mescla of religion and authority, and it left human traces in families who never recovered. The final fact is stark and simple. Institutions entrusted to protect dignity can become tools of humiliation when wielded by those who believe themselves beyond reproach. The scars of Elagabalus's rule are not merely scandal and satire, they are the quiet, long aftermath in lives narrowed by violence. History records the spectacle, the most honest reading listens for the silences it left